Alright, and welcome to the nonfiction book report for Andrew Marr's A History of the World. The idea behind the nonfiction book report is for me to comment on the books that I have read, which are nonfiction books. The fiction book rewards for the fantasy, sci-fi, and the other history and historical fiction on different channel. This channel's focus is more on the academic type of discussions, and therefore I will be doing the non-fiction book reports here. Now, the idea is that once I read the book, I will be discussing what information I saw in the book, how this information was presented, and whether the information was properly presented correctly, and what kind of a reader you should be to read this book, or maybe you should be reading the book at all. Now, I will not be doing the same commentary on every single book, for simple reason is that I do not have the background to talk about every single book the same way. Basically, let's say it this way, I do not have any background in quantum physics, so after reading quantum physics book, I cannot discuss how accurate the information is in that book because I do not have the background in it. If I have a background in the book, I will be in what the book discusses, then I will be talking about. I do have a certain amount of a background in terms of I did study a certain amount of history. I do not have a university degree in it to talk about in greater detail, but I do know a lot thanks to my own independent study because I took some courses through university also. Now, because of this reason, I will not be talking much about the Andrew Marr's A History of the World. The second reason is because it's a history of the world. It's pretty difficult to have a decent enough background to talk about the whole history of the world, and therefore I will not be discussing the details of the events that he's presenting in the book and critiquing them, but rather critiquing the whole book overall and how good of a read is it. Now, every book has an author, and therefore it's very important to focus on that author because the author, well, basically the author's qualification determine whether he or she can talk about the subject that they're writing about. Therefore, they have certain amount of authority on the subject, and that will translate in whether the book is good enough to be read. Let's give you an example. An economist writing about economics has a lot of background in it. Well, economist who's writing economics has basically a type of understanding of economics that usually the lay person does not have. Therefore, he has more qualifications, I would say, to write such a book than anybody else who does not have a background in economics. Some people might have studied economics enough to gain a background in it to talk about it, and then of course they should have that. And I would look into usually the other's background to see if the person has enough background to talk about what he's talking in the book. Or if the person does not have the background, then there is a question of how much of the information presented in the book is good information, how accurate it is if the person does not have the qualifications to do so. Now, Andrew Marr is a journalist. He's also been described as a political commentator. He did write books about history of Britain, and therefore he does have certain amount of background to talk about history and overall different processes that occur in history because of his political commentary and his journalist background, where he focused on the political events. Now, that does not mean that he has the background to talk about ancient history, medieval history, Renaissance, and such. He does have, most of his work been focused on current history, currently what's happening in current situations. So therefore, he does have less of a qualifications to talk about this. He did write 2 books about history of Britain, so he has certain amount of knowledge about this, about history, but history of Britain is not history of the world, and so therefore it's not the same. Also, he does express some views in this book that could be controversial. Specifically, he talks about war and how it was beneficial during certain period of human history for human development and for introduction of certain processes and inventions into human lifestyle of the period that kind of pushed forward humanity as far as he sees it. Now, why it could be controversial? Well, because it's war, and while we do know the certain amount of technological progress that occurs during the war due to the needs of the military, there's also a huge loss of life and usually a lot of economic devastation that occurs during war. So this kind of idea is a bit controversial, and therefore you cannot. I would immediately say that there's that kind of a situation happening throughout his book. He does present some things, but they are not as clear cut as he sometimes, I think, presents them. Now, and for that reason, I'm again repeating the fact that he does not have 100% same qualifications, I would say, as a history professor who really focused his whole life on study of history in comparison to Andrew Marr in this case. Overall, though, he still does a very good job of presenting different facts and different events in history. Now, let's talk about the book itself. The book is basically an accompanying book to BBC documentary, or maybe documentary accompanies a book. Generally, I would say one or the other. I'm not exactly sure which one came first. Doesn't really matter to me because I'm talking mostly about the book, but I've seen the documentary as well. I would say that the documentary is less, well, how to say it, I guess not as good as the book for certain reasons. One of those reasons is that the book goes into greater details when it discusses certain events or certain people. It presents more, really, because it just has more capabilities to do it. It has more pages to write on that, while the documentaries are limited in its terms of how much time they can put forward for each event, for each anecdote, for each person that they're presenting, because it's limited to that 60-minute format. I believe these documentaries had several episodes, 7 I think, or 8, all of 60-minute format, but they have to go through a lot of chunk of history in each, well, yeah, I guess we can say it's a big chunk of history or big period of history in each episode. Now, approach the author takes towards world history is a bit controversial. He openly says in introduction that because of his training, because he's a journalist, he will focus more on people and how people drive history, rather than, let's say, as quite often historians like to point at the overall processes that occur through history that drive it, or the process that occur through overall population that drive it, the demographics of it, and such things. So basically, that school of thought does not believe that people drive history. They believe that overall events occur because of the more complicated factors. So example of that would be is that if Napoleon did not exist, there would have been another French general who would have taken his place and would have done pretty much the same thing. Therefore, Napoleon is not the one who's driving history, but rather a person driven by events, and therefore those events drive history. Now, Andrew Marr presents the idea that these are the people, these are the main movers of history. And he openly says it. He openly says that this is not, approach that's taken by most historians, and therefore, since it's said so in the introduction, and any book that is not fiction book should present its own style of what and how it's going to discuss things in the beginning of the book, so that the reader kind of gains a certain understanding of what the book will be like. Can decide then whether to read the book or to stop reading. And therefore, if you a person who will disagree with that approach by Andrew Marr about how the history of the world is actually made, is that you do not believe that the people drive it, then this might not be the book for you. Maybe you should not be reading it. Now, the narrative of the book is very important to me because it's how easy to read the book. The more complicated the structure of the book, the harder it is to read. The more person has to go back, maybe reread the paragraphs, or more has to sit down and try to figure out what the author is trying to say. The easier flowing narrative, unlike, let's say, a more technical narrative, allows for easier reading. I do a lot of my reading while I'm on the public transit, and therefore easy reading is easier for me. But that does not mean that it's an approach that every book has to take. More technical specific approach of writing is done specifically for higher type of a level of reader. So in other words, if you're getting more into nitty gritty of something, then you're going to be looking for more technical written approach, which is it's not as easy to read, but usually conveys information more specific, in a more specific fashion, and more exact fashion. Now the flowing narrative comes here because Andrew Marr is a journalist. He knows how to write easy, and its approach of the book is definitely for casual reader. There is no overall overriding theme. There are some themes in the chapter, so the chapter tries to carry a theme. They're not that successful in ability to overall describe a theme that you want to convey, and there's no overall overriding theme in the book, partially because, again, Andrew Marr is focusing on specific events, on specific people, and therefore it's kind of hard to create an overall theme, to present some kind of a theme throughout the whole history if you're picking and choosing only specific persons and how they moved history. If that's a theme, then that would be the only theme that could be seen in this book. But again, this is the history of the world, a very casually written one. Therefore, I would not expect this kind of overall overriding theme in this book. The book itself should be seen as more of an anthology. Why do I say that? Is because, well, let's say if I want to get myself familiar with certain literature, let's say it's a post-apocalyptic fiction, then I would go and seek out an anthology of post-apocalyptic fiction short stories and read them. As I read them, I mark the stories that I really liked. Then I look at the authors who wrote those stories, and then I read more of those authors. This is how I usually approach my research when I want to decide to explore some kind of genre or some kind of theme in literature. I look for an anthology and then go for the authors that I did like. Same thing with this book. It's an introduction to world history. As you read it, you should be picking up on the events, people that you like, and that you want to go in deeper to find out more about them. But this is in no way a reference source. This is not something that you would put as a reference in the bibliography of a paper or an essay if you are writing something for a university or high school. I'm not talking about academic journals, because I'm pretty sure they would not reference this work at all, because it's just too casual. One great thing about this book is that it does not focus on history of the world as if it's a history of the West. Now it's more becoming basically a standard now not to focus on history of the West when you're writing a history of the world, when you're talking about history of the world. But the older books do that a lot, because that used to be the general presentation of history. You would start with Near East, we're talking about usually ancient Egypt, move on to Mesopotamia, talk about maybe a bit about Persia, move to Greece, then to Rome, and get stuck in Europe after that. Anytime the history of the world that was presented in the old style would ever present anything about events happening outside of Europe, it only would be when the Europe went there. So now as Crusades happened, now we talk about a bit the Muslim civilization, but that's it, only around the time of Crusades, and then we stop, and then we go to the whole period of colonization of Americas, and then colonization of the world. And it's always was Europe went there, and that's the only time you talk about any other part of the world in its history. That was the usual focus of history of the world. Andrew Marr's A History of the World does not do that. It does focus on people and stories outside of the West, which is a very good thing. Again, if person is beginning to just learn about history, this will be great, because it immediately builds a picture that there's more things happening than just happening in Europe or the West itself. Now, as I mentioned before, this is a collection of stories and anecdotes about different people, and therefore it's not the same as some of the history books I read, where they try to bind everything together, trying to create type of overriding theme or show how the events are shaping things. Here it's more, well, this was happening because you have this and this guy, great king who's uniting, and as a result now we have you had the United Kingdom. They created such and such artifacts, we had such and such social developments, and that's it. And then we move on to a different story and such. There's not as much of a connection. There's attempts to do so, but not that strong attempts. Say the attempts are good, but the result is not there. So from that perspective, again, I would say that this is not anything but introduction to world history, and should be treated as such. So in conclusion, I would like to say that this is a book for a person who wants to just casually approach the study of history. If you know a certain amount about world history, you might not find this book that worth your time, for simple reason that you most likely will know everything that he's talking about. Now, one thing I did not talk about, and I believe I skipped over this, even though I had it on the slides, is this thing: the events, interpretation events versus a BBC documentary. This is the reason I believe the book is better, is because, again, given greater amount of space that the author has to express the ideas, he's able to build them better, and therefore they don't seem to be as one-sided. A good example is that the documentary makes it look like the October Revolution in Russia happened because it was a German conspiracy. He literally points at it in the documentary by saying, "Oh look, the Germans masterminded the idea of moving Lenin from Switzerland to Russia so that he could start the revolution. They gave him this ability, they gave him some certain amount of funding, and therefore, we have revolution happening now." This is what kind of conclusion could be drawn watching the documentary. Reading the book, this is not the conclusion that a person will come up with, because the book also says that there were other type of revolutionaries, you might say, people who would have been seen as the troublemakers by the Russian Empire, who were traveling along with Lenin. So you literally had the Germans introduce a bunch of people who could cause problems back into the Russian Empire, so that they would cause problems and keep destabilizing the country. But in no way it could be said that they actually were thinking that yes, Lenin is going to be the one who's going to pull through and do all this stuff. It's not as clearly presented in the book, and I believe it's not as clear in overall when we're talking about the events of October Revolution, and what in the events that led up to it either. So this was overall my impression of the Andrew Marr's History of the World. This is what I believe the book is like, and again I'm gonna say this is for a casual reader, person who's casually interested in world history. If the person does not have ability to read the book for some reason, then watching the documentary will be pretty much the same. Again, for a casual person, if you want to get more detailed information, I guess you can read the book, but then if you're really interested in world history, I would suggest to go and start researching into more focused volumes and other books that deal in more specifics and deal in more technical then. Alright, and thank you for watching and listening.